Boomer Von Kennen, WBT.
And you're off.
It's 5:05 and welcome into a Tuesday edition of the Carolina Journal News Hour. News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. I'm Nick Craig. Good morning to you. We start with an update this morning in the high-stakes race for the North Carolina Supreme Court. The State Board of Elections filed a petition yesterday asking the state Supreme Court to take up an election dispute involving the seat on the state's highest court. The petition asks the Supreme Court to bypass the North Carolina Court of Appeals, where that is currently being dealt with. Without action from the highest court, the appellate court schedule would extend this dispute at least into portions of early March. Appointed incumbent Democrat Allison Riggs leads Republican Jefferson Griffin, who is currently an appeals court judge, obviously would be recused from this case, by 734 votes out of more than 5.5 million ballots cast statewide in the November the 5th election. 2 recounts have confirmed Riggs's lead, but Griffin is asking the court to order election officials to throw out some 65,000 plus ballots. Riggs supports the election board's bypass petition, according to the court filing. Griffin opposes the measure. Wake County Superior Court Judge William Pittman rejected Griffin's request on February the 7th. Griffin filed notice of appeal 3 days later. The case is currently on its way to the State Court of Appeals. Monday's filing asks the Supreme Court to take the case out of the appeals court hands. The election board is considering the petitioner before the Supreme Court. Griffin, the respondent, and Riggs is an intervener in the case. Justice Department lawyer led by North Carolina Solicitor General Ryan Parks wrote in the bypass appeal, "Immediate review is appropriate because the subject matter of this appeal has significant public interest. The appeal involves legal principles of major significance, and a delay in this court's review is likely to cause substantial harm." The Supreme Court already has addressed this case once. Griffin filed a request with the High Court back on December the 18th to deal with a writ of prohibition blocking the election board from certifying Riggs as the election's winner. After a trip to federal court, the case did return to the state Supreme Court back on January the 6th, about a month and a half ago. On the following day, the court voted 4-2 to grant a temporary stay, meaning that the State Board of Elections could not certify the results. On January the 22nd, the court denied Griffin's request for a writ of prohibition, left the stay in place, and sent the case back to a trial court. Justices urged the Superior Court to act expeditiously or in a quick fashion. Back to comments from Solicitor General Ryan Park. He said, "In ruling on the writ of prohibition, moreover, a majority of the justices of this court described this case as essential to preserving the public's trust and confidence in our elections. These observations were correct. In a case of this magnitude, the public interest would have served by prompt adjudication by this court of the state law issued that respondent raises." That would be Griffin. The case also raises a significant legal issue, the court filing indicated. Reading directly from the filing yesterday, quote, "For example, this case raises the question whether, under state law, election rules may be retroactively changed to invalidate ballots that were cast in compliance with the rules in place at the time of the election. Contrary to the court's decision in Pender County v. Bartlett, a 2007 precedent, that issue alone is significant under any definition of the word. And this court is aware respondents, aka Griffin's challenges, raise other significant state law issues as well." According to Ryan Parks, he says delay in resolving this case would cause substantial harm, saying, quote, "Here too the parties agree. Respondent has emphasized the need for an expeditious and final determination of this dispute. That need for prompt resolution is why he chose to file an original action in this court. And even while dismissing the writ of prohibition, this court ordered the case to proceed expeditiously. The same need for prompt resolution of this case applies on the appeal. Now that the petitioner has followed the proper procedural channels for seeking judicial review of the protests. The election board seeks action on its petition by March the 3rd. Riggs supports the bypass petition as well as the expedited schedule, according to Solicitor General Ryan Park. Griffin opposes the idea. Griffin intends to file a response to this request in ordinary court. It says, quote, Judge Griffin opposes the bypass petition, the Rule 2 motion, and the motion to expedite because the requests are prejudicial to Judge Griffin. According to the petition, Judge Griffin is currently working under expedited deadlines at the Court of Appeal for both the record on appeal and his opening briefs at the court. The state board's filing should be summarily denied without prejudice to refile after a record on the appeal is docketed with the Court of Appeals. Just so you are aware, the Court of Appeals has 15 members and will hear the case in a 3-judge panel. Republicans outnumber Democrats 12-3 on the North Carolina Court of Appeals. However, Griffin, who currently sits on that, will obviously not take part, so Republicans would hold an 11-3 margin, indicating that the likelihood of there being at least 2 Republicans on the 3-judge panel is probably pretty high. Republicans hold a 5-2 majority on the Supreme Court. Without Riggs participating in the case, the majority is 5-1. One Republican, Justice Richard Dietz, voted against the original order granting Griffin a stay. The appeals court issued an order Thursday spelling out a schedule that was last week for hearing the case. It calls for the court record to be finalized this week, with briefings to last through March the 3rd. The schedule did not include oral arguments, and it did not set a deadline for a decision. Riggs continues to serve on the Supreme Court while the dispute continues, and Griffin also continues in his post on the North Carolina Court of Appeals. So as we continue to track this very important statewide story, continues to be a lot of moving parts. We'll keep an eye on it here on the News Hour. You can also read details this morning, the full summary available over at carolinajournal.com. Taking a look at some other statewide news at 5:12 this morning, North Carolina is emerging as a top destination for young professionals and families, with more than 110,000 new residents arriving in 2023 alone. That's according to a latest report from Storage Cafe. This represents the state's highest level of net migration in a decade and secures its place as the 3rd most popular relocated destination in the United States since 2014, trailing only Texas and Florida. Notably, the influx was driven largely by millennials and Gen Z. Millennials accounted for a net increase of more than 30,900 residents in 2023, while Gen X added another 22,000 plus, making those two generations a major component of the Tar Heel State's growing population. Florida and New York top the list as the primary source of new North Carolina residents. Families relocating from these states are saving significantly on housing costs, with an average home price in North Carolina being 27% lower than New York and nearly 19% lower than Florida. Many residents from South Carolina, Virginia, and Georgia also flocking to the state as well. Emilia Mann, the lead analysis behind the Storage Cafe migration study, said in a statement, quote, "Interstate and regional migration are undergoing significant shifts driven by the pursuit of affordability and better living conditions. Residents are increasingly relocating to areas with lower housing costs and less competition, often where active construction meets demand, offering diverse housing options for both buyers and renters." A recent report by Carolina Journal, our statistics indicate that nearly 4 in 10 movers to North Carolina managed to achieve home ownership within their first year. You can read more on the Storage Cafe study on our website this morning. The link is available over at carolinajournal.com, where it's now 5:15. News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. We will get a look at traffic on this Tuesday morning, an update with Boomer Von Cannon.
Hey, thanks.
It's 5:20. Welcome back to the Carolina Journal News Hour. Don't forget, we are streaming live this morning on our Carolina Journal YouTube channel. You can also take the show with you on demand on your own time by checking out the Carolina Journal News Hour podcast. It's available wherever you get your shows. Search for Carolina Journal News Hour in your favorite podcast app. Tap the subscribe button and you'll get a new show delivered each and every weekday morning. It's the Carolina Journal News Hour podcast. Download and subscribe now. Well, starting May the 7th, coming up here in just a couple of months, North Carolinians will need a real ID to board domestic flights and enter federal buildings or military bases. Those without a real ID can use a U.S. passport or other federally approved ID instead. To see if you have a real ID, look for a gold star in the upper right-hand corner of your current North Carolina driver's license. Real IDs must be obtained in person at a North Carolina DMV office. Required documents include proof of identity, social security number, residency, and, if applicable, name change or lawful status. Appointments can be scheduled online, but availability does continue to be incredibly limited with the DMV, so checking for openings or considering walk-in appointments are recommended. Again, that real ID deadline as of right now is May the 7th. We've seen that pushed back numerous times over the last couple of years, but again, May the 7th, 2025, so make sure you make some plans to get ahead of that. It's 5:21. You're listening to the Carolina Journal News Hour. There is a town called Carrboro right outside of Chapel Hill, and they're making some news this morning as they are suing Duke Energy. They are the largest electrical producer and provider here in the state of North Carolina. To get some more details on that, it's my pleasure to welcome back to the Carolina Journal News Hour this morning the editor-in-chief of CarolinaJournal.com, Donna King. Donna, this town, it's not small. It's about 22,000 people, but they're going after the behemoth in Duke Energy. What are the details on that you're tracking this morning?
Yeah, of course. Good morning. This is coming from the Town Council of Carrboro, North Carolina. It's in Orange County, just outside of Chapel Hill. This town council has filed a lawsuit against Duke Energy for what they describe as they want damages for climate-related harm, saying they're alleging that the utility misled the public about the dangers of fossil fuel emissions and how fast they would switch to renewables and that kind of thing. There's a couple of things about this. One, there have been other lawsuits like this from climate activist groups in other states. This is the first time that an actual municipality, as opposed to a group of activists, have filed a lawsuit. And it's also against a big utility. So there's a couple of different layers to this, which make it pretty interesting. One being a municipality. This is funded by a group called NCInnovation. Now, NCInnovation is a nonprofit group that is working on goals that include things like accelerating the transition to clean power and to try to really pump up the press coverage of the what they say the crisis of climate change. So this lawsuit is one of them. And what that's meant, though, that critics are saying this is just all political theater to make a point, and they're using the court system to do it.
Well, I guess it would be a valid question to ask if you're suing somebody and claiming damages. Do they have any specific examples of what specifically Duke Energy has done to hurt this town of about 22,000 people right outside Chapel Hill?
Well, one of the things they're pointing to, which I think is interesting, is they're pointing to Hurricane Helene as being evidence of the damage of climate change, and that Duke Energy is participating in a misinformation campaign about the risk of climate change. So, we've had our own policy analyst and environmental expert here at the John Locke Foundation talk about that. And really even the Obama administration, folks that have worked there have said that attempt to link hurricanes to climate change is not really grounded in science. And even one of them called it, dishonest. So, some of the basics of what this lawsuit is predicated on are being debated within the scientific community. But I also think that it is getting what they wanted. It's getting that publicity to their issues. But groups like the Consumer Choice Center, they're saying that what this really does is it undermines the progress that North Carolina, the very real progress that North Carolina has made toward reducing emissions.
Well, let me ask you just that. Duke has been in the news for the last couple of decades, it seems, at this point, Donna, as they've converted a vast majority of their coal plants to steam plants. They are on carbon reduction goals, depending on what program you look at, 2030, 2050, as they kind of come alongside a lot of the things that the Cooper administration wanted to do in regards to reducing emissions and things like that. It seems rather interesting that they've been leading this clean energy transition, if you'll call it that, and now they're being sued, I guess, for not doing it quick enough.
That's what they're saying. They're saying that they weren't moving down the timeline that they wanted, and but it is important. You're right. This whole transition to clean energy has been a big focus of the Cooper administration. And really, if you look at just back to 2020 to 2005, just over the last 20 years, North Carolina has reduced its carbon output by 52%. This is the emissions from electricity have declined 52% over the last 20 years. And you really have to look at that. The Energy Institute also says if you compare that to, say, like China, they're increasing all the time. The rest of the world is increasing. So this focus on North Carolina specifically in this lawsuit may have difficulty getting traction.
That was going to be my next question for you. Yeah. What exactly does something like this look like, Donna? How do we go forward? Again, you're talking about a relatively small township going after a major electrical producer and provider that's not just in North Carolina. They're up from Ohio all the way down to the Florida coast. What does the next step for something like this look like? Is this a state, a federal issue? Where does this go?
Well, they filed it in Orange County, in Superior Court of Orange County, so that's where it would be heard there. But the head of NC Warren, who's funding and who's doing this lawsuit and supporting this lawsuit, says that this is sort of like what the tobacco companies did. That's the connection that they're trying to draw. The Duke Energy is like the tobacco companies in that they're misleading the public about the risks of climate change. I think that they're going to have a hard time doing that, but we'll see, because there have been these lawsuits in other places. In Honolulu, in a lawsuit that's only similar, it's a little bit different in that it's not filed by a municipality, the state of Honolulu settled that lawsuit. So I would be surprised if Duke Energy took that tactic, but I do think that this should be interesting to watch, because it's a trend of starting to look at lawfare as a way to make your political point.
Do you think if something like this escalated to more of the federal level, and we saw maybe more states, more municipalities, even maybe counties and cities, much smaller geographical areas, going after these major electrical and utility providers across the country, that we'd maybe see some conversation or some comments coming in from the federal government in regards to this?
If you look at, there was a lawsuit similar to this filed in San Francisco. And one thing that came out of that is that the Ninth Circuit Court actually said that the lawsuit needed to be dismissed. And a group there asked the U.S. Supreme Court to take up the case instead, even though the Ninth Circuit, which, they're not by any stretch of the imagination going to be right-leaning, they said that this lawsuit needed to be dismissed there. So the plaintiffs in that suit asked the U.S. Supreme Court to take it up, and they have not responded. So I would anticipate that this is really going to generate press and discussion and truthfully spend a lot of left-leaning money when now that the election is over, they've got a place to put it.
Very interesting information this morning. You can read more details on our story by visiting CarolinaJournal.com. It's now 5:28 on the Carolina Journal News Hour, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. It's time for another look at traffic this morning. An update with Boomer Von Cannon.
Hey, thank you, Nick.
It's 5:35. Welcome back to the Carolina Journal News Hour. Good Tuesday morning to you. News Talk 1110 99.3 WBT. We continue to track details out of the high-stakes race for the North Carolina Supreme Court this morning. Yesterday, the North Carolina State Board of Elections filed a petition asking the state Supreme Court to take up the election dispute that involves that race. The petition filed by the SBE asks the Supreme Court to bypass the North Carolina Court of Appeals. Without action from the highest court, the appeals court schedule as it's written right now would extend this dispute until at least early March. Appointed incumbent Democrat Allison Riggs currently leads Republican Jefferson Griffin, who is a member of the Court of Appeals, by 734 votes out of more than 5.5 million ballots cast. Griffin does not support this move. Riggs does support it. We'll continue to track the details. You can read more information this morning by visiting our website, carolinajournal.com. It's now 5:36 on the Carolina Journal News Hour. There is a private investment group in our state known as NCInnovation. We've talked about it a couple of times in the past here on the Carolina Journal News Hour. We've got some new updates this morning. Before we get into those updates, we'll welcome Jeff Moore from carolinajournal.com to talk about those. Jeff, before we get into the news of the day, can you give us a little backstory on what NCInnovation is? It's not something that's always making the 5 or 6 o'clock news. What is that?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, this is a relatively new organization. It got established privately several years ago in 2018 by some business leaders in North Carolina. But it was just last year, or really late in 2023, during the North Carolina state legislature's budget cycle, that it got awarded $500 million of taxpayer money in 2 different installments of $250 million each. And that money is to be used for an endowment for the purposes of accomplishing the vision of NCInnovation, which is to fund grants that could help commercialize research at the public university level in North Carolina. So this is something that those business leaders got together and thought would be a great idea. They needed a certain amount of money to generate the kind of investment returns in order to fund the grants. And so they went to the legislature during the late hours of the budget negotiations in 2023. And we're looking for about $1.2 billion actually to put into an endowment, but they walked away with $500 million, which they have all of those funds now in their accounts, and they're generating interest and interest income. And the latest update for NCInnovation is after the last year of searching for and evaluating different investment managers, they have finally selected a manager to run the endowment from which the proceeds will go to the grantees that they select through the rest of their boards and subcommittees.
And so just to break this down for individuals, you've got obviously a lot of research and studies that are done within our public universities, and some of those have practical business implications and things that can be sold. From what I understand, as you described, this NCInnovation is kind of that intermediary between the universities and the private sector and getting maybe some of this technology or new ideas out into kind of a commercial market.
Yeah, so the idea being that we do a lot of public university research, and some of it does get commercialized. But the leaders that really came together around the NCInnovation idea saw that a lot of them fall into a gap, I think they call it a valley of death, where they don't attract the attention of venture capitalists and other funders that would help get that research to a commercially viable point where they have a proof of concept and they actually have got some prototypes and everything like that. So it could be anything from biotech to cleaning water of heavy metals and things like that, making lithium ion batteries more efficient or safer. And so they saw all of these things, and they think if we have the public university research going on in North Carolina, we'd like to help them cross that valley of death and then develop commercially within the state. So that's the kind of the grand vision of the leaders, is to use this money to get the grantees, the researchers at the public universities, closer to that finish line where they commercialize the products, and they would have some agreements to stay and have production or what have you, to keep it in North Carolina so that there's jobs and economic development. So it's kind of a big economic development push developed by these business leaders in North Carolina and financed, as it were, by taxpayers after their lobbying effort in 2023.
And I guess we're kind of paying for this stuff on the front side. We're funding a lot of this research through the university system. So you can understand and maybe see the path as to how something like NCInnovation pops up. But you just kind of hit the nail right on the head there, Jeff. This is $500 million worth of taxpayer money that's going into that. And there's been a lot of criticism thrown at this group, this organization, because of the copious amount of money. And I think you mentioned earlier, they requested over $1 billion originally. That's a lot of money out of our state budget.
Yeah, they're mapping out what kind of corpus of money would actually spit out enough investment returns to fund like $20 to $50 million of grants in a year. And so they're asking for over $1 billion. They had the North Carolina Senate actually on board with some of those numbers initially. The North Carolina House was much more skeptical, maybe not of the idea, but of the idea of giving them taxpayer money to accomplish their vision. And so there were some negotiations in between, and they, I think the NC House had a proposal to give them $50 million to start out and maybe get a proof of concept of their own that this is something that could pan out for the best interests of North Carolina and the taxpayers that are funding it. But at the end of the process, it was $500 million to $250 million tranches that they got. And so off the top, there's been some resistance and criticism of the idea itself being funded by taxpayers. But in the interim, as they've been established and received this money, there have been lots of other things as well. There have been some directors that were appointed by the General Assembly that have been critical of the transparency or lack of transparency going on with NCInnovation. They were required to raise a certain amount of private funds to fund operations and whatnot, and also had a lot of other stipulations and requirements from the legislature to receive these funds. And some think that they may be falling short on some of those. And then also some conflicts of interest issues as far as especially with this latest selection of a manager. You've got a private raise of capital, about $25 million, and a lot of the donors that donated that capital or pledged to donate that capital were financial institutions. And some of those are the same financial institutions that were in the finalist lists of the investment manager. And then in the end, ultimately, Wells Fargo was selected to be the investment manager for this $500 million endowment. And they were also a donor at the initiation of NCInnovation, helping to accomplish that private capital raise requirement issued by the legislature. So there are some issues with the kind of the direction of the board. You've got some directors that have really been hard-nosed at calling out some of the discrepancies here, and we saw that continue in the board meeting last week as they ultimately selected this manager, because you had some board members voting against the selection. There were some discrepancies in the numbers, and if at the very least they were looking to kind of go back and revisit everything to look at apples to apples comparisons. But you have one director on the board appointed by the legislature as a former legislator himself, Mr. Sasser, and he voted no against the selection of the investment manager and sought to give comment there to say that he did not think that his former colleagues in the North Carolina House, the legislators, were going to be too happy about how things went today, speaking about the meeting there, because there were so many discrepancies about the numbers and exactly what information the directors had to make this important decision.
It's definitely something we will keep an eye on. Jeff, you've got a lot more quotes from individuals on that board. Where do folks go and read that article this morning?
Yeah, CarolinaJournal.com. You can find the latest on NCInnovation and the history of NCInnovation going back over the last year or so, all at CarolinaJournal.com. Jeff
Moore joins us this morning on the Carolina Journal News Hour. Where it's now 5:44, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. It's time for another look at traffic on this Tuesday morning and updates with Boomer Von Cannon.
Hey, thanks, Nick.
Hot.
It's 5:51. Welcome back to the Carolina Journal News Hour. News Talk 1110 99.3 WBT. Good Tuesday morning to you. North Carolina is emerging as a top destination for young professionals and families, with more than 110,000 new residents arriving in 2023 alone, according to the latest report from Storage Cafe. This represents the state's highest level of net migration in a decade and secures its place as the third most popular relocation destination in the country since 2014, trailing only Texas and Florida. Notably, the influx was driven largely by millennials and Generation Z, millennials accounting for a net influx of almost 31,000 residents in 2023, while Gen X added 22,000, making those two generations a major component of the Tar Heel State's growing population. Florida and New York topped the list as the primary source of North Carolina residents relocating to the states. Families moving here from these states are saving significantly on housing costs, with average home prices in North Carolina being 27% lower than in New York and nearly 19% lower than Florida. Many residents also from places like South Carolina, Virginia, and Georgia also flocking to the Tar Heel State. Emilia Mann, the lead analyst behind the Storage Cafe migration study, said in a statement, quote, "Interstate and regional migration are undergoing significant shifts driven by the pursuit of affordability and better living conditions. Residents are increasingly relocating to areas with lower housing costs and less competition, often where active construction meets demand, offering diverse housing options for both buyers and renters." As recently reported by CarolinaJournal.com, statistics indicate that nearly 4 in 10 individuals that move to North Carolina manage to achieve home ownership within their first year. You can read more details on the Storage Cafe study by visiting our website this morning, CarolinaJournal.com. Coming up here in just a few months, North Carolinians will need a real ID to board commercial flights and ensure access to secure federal buildings. Real IDs will be required across the United States for anyone who wants to travel by air, even if it's a domestic flight, or if you plan on entering federal buildings or military bases. Those who do not have a real ID can use a U.S. passport or a federally approved identification like a U.S. passport card or a permanent resident cards. Real IDs will be enforced nationwide starting May the 7th of this year, and you will want to obtain a real ID beforehand if possible. And if you're wondering if you have a real ID or not this morning, and take a look at your driver's license, and if there is a gold star in the upper right-hand corner, that indicates that you currently have a real ID and not just a regular North Carolina driver's license. And one thing that's important to note, a real ID cannot be ordered online. Individuals will have to go in person to a North Carolina DMV office with the following documentation: one document with your full name and date of birth, one document with your full name and social security number, 2 documents with your current physical address, 1 document proving liability insurance coverage for a licensed provider, 1 document verifying a name change if that's applicable, and 1 document proving lawful status if you're a non-U.S. citizen. You can currently schedule an appointment online with the North Carolina DMV. However, you'll notice that those appointments are very much booked up, and so you are potentially looking at doing a drop-in or waiting in line for an appointment, as again, this May the 7th, 2025 deadline is where things stand right now. Real ID has been moved back a couple of times in the past. No indication whether that's going to happen this time. Again, May the 7th is the deadline to receive a North Carolina Real ID, or if you already have a passport, you can use that in the meantime while you're waiting to get that ID updated. Well, the town of Carrboro, North Carolina, has filed a lawsuit against Duke Energy, alleging that the utility company misled the public about fossil fuel emissions and a timeline for renewable energy adoption. Supported and funded by NC WARN, W-A-R-N, the suit seeks damages for climate-related harms, pointing to things like Hurricane Helene's impact as an example. The suit was filed in Orange County Superior Court in Hillsborough. John Sanders, who is the director of the Center for Food, Power, and Life at the John Locke Foundation, said, quote, Carrboro's lawsuit is a sensational attempt to win a high-dollar judgment against Duke Energy. Nevertheless, the lawsuit ought to be laughed out of court. The idea that, as stated in the lawsuit, Duke's actions are substantially responsible for causing and accelerating climate change is ridiculous and unprovable. The lawsuit even calls Hurricane Helene, quote, a stark example of climate change-fueled hurricanes, which is anti-scientific nonsense strictly at odds with climate science, according to John Sanders. Similar climate lawsuits have been filed in towns like Honolulu, San Francisco, and Minneapolis. However, this is the first to be filed by a municipality against an energy utility. The Carrboro mayor said, quote, we have to speak truth to power as we continue to fight the existential threat that is climate change. The climate crisis continues to burden our community and cost residents their hard-earned tax dollars. Duke Energy's knowledge of the environmental injustice being caused by the use of fossil fuels has unfairly plagued our community for decades. We will continue to track details on this lawsuit over at CarolinaJournal.com and right here on the Carolina Journal News Hour. That's going to do it for a Tuesday edition. WBT News is next, followed by Good Morning BT. We are back with you tomorrow morning at 5 to 6 a.m. right here on News Talk 1110 and 99.3 WBT.